For many families, the financial pressure does not begin with rent, it does not begin with groceries. It begins in a place they cannot avoid and cannot ignore, the gas station. A higher price at the pump does more than make one errand more expensive. It changes the math of the entire week. It affects the commute to work, the school run, the grocery trip, the cost of staying mobile, and the margin a household thought it still had. And what makes this pressure so frustrating is not only how quickly it appears, it is how slowly it seems to leave. That is the question at the center of this story. Why do gas prices seem to rise immediately, while relief for ordinary families comes much more slowly? Why does the pressure arrive in a single fill-up but remain long after the first shock has passed? This is not really a story about energy traders, refinery schedules, or market jargon. It is a story about everyday economic life, about how one visible cost can alter the way people think, spend, and plan, and about why fuel, more than most prices, has the power to make a household feel financially exposed almost overnight. Gasoline occupies a unique place in the economy because it is one of the few prices people see constantly. Most households do not track wholesale food costs. They do not monitor freight contracts. They do not check the daily movement of utility inputs. But they do see gas prices. They see them on the way to work. They see them while driving home. They see them when they are already tired, already busy, already thinking about bills. That constant visibility matters. A rise in gas prices does not stay abstract for very long. It becomes personal almost immediately. The number is posted in giant digits. The impact is direct. There is no waiting for a monthly statement to understand what changed. There is no delay between the price shift and the household reaction. When gasoline rises, people feel it in real time. And for middle-class households, that real-time pressure lands hard. Gasoline is not a discretionary purchase for most working families. It is tied to employment, routine, and responsibility. People may be able to delay buying clothes, cancel a dinner out, or put off a larger purchase, but many cannot simply stop driving. They still have to get to work. They still have to take children to school. They still have to buy groceries, attend appointments, and manage the ordinary obligations that make up daily life. That is why fuel prices carry a different kind of emotional and financial weight. They affect people not as a luxury expense, but as a cost of functioning. When that cost rises suddenly, the sense of control inside a household often weakens just as suddenly. The issue is not only that the family spends more money on gas, it is that the increase reaches into the rest of the budget immediately. A more expensive tank often means less flexibility somewhere else. It may mean waiting another week before buying something needed at home. It may mean cutting back on non-essential spending that was already modest. It may mean rethinking trips, combining errands, or becoming more cautious with every small purchase. And that process begins quickly, because the signal from the pump is so clear and so frequent. That is one reason gasoline has such a strong effect on the public mood. It is not just a line item, it is a repeated reminder. A family that fills up once or twice a week does not experience fuel inflation as an occasional inconvenience. It experiences it as a recurring financial message. Week after week, the same pressure reappears. And because it reappears so often, it can shape behavior faster than many other rising costs. This is where a fuel story becomes a broader economic story. At first glance, it may seem like the issue is limited to transportation. But in reality, gasoline works its way into the structure of daily life much more deeply than that. A household does not need to be struggling in every area to feel vulnerable when fuel becomes unstable. It only needs a budget with limited room for surprises. And that describes a large share of ordinary families. For many people, financial stability is not the same thing as abundance. It is not about having endless slack in the monthly budget. It is about predictability. It is about knowing what the major costs are likely to be and feeling reasonably confident that the household can absorb them. Gasoline becomes such a powerful stress point because it disrupts that predictability. When the price moves sharply, it sends a signal that one of the most basic weekly expenses is no longer stable. And once that feeling takes hold, the impact extends beyond the pump itself. People start looking at the rest of their finances differently. They begin asking quieter but more important questions. Can we absorb this and still stay on track this month? What do we need to cut back on now? If this keeps going, what gives way next? That is why the visible problem matters so much. Gasoline is not merely expensive in those moments. It becomes a kind of warning light for the household economy. It tells people that the balance they were trying to maintain has become harder to maintain. And even if the increase is concentrated at the pump, the psychological effect reaches further. It changes the tone of household spending. It narrows confidence. It makes ordinary decisions feel more constrained. In that sense, fuel does something many costs do not. It compresses economic stress into a highly visible, highly repeatable experience. Rent may be larger, but it arrives once a month. Utility bills may rise, but they come later. Grocery prices can creep up gradually. Gasoline is different. It announces itself immediately. It forces a direct response. And because so many families cannot avoid the purchase, the burden feels less like a choice and more like exposure. This is what makes the problem larger than the number on the sign. The rise in gas prices is not only a matter of spending more on fuel, it is a signal that the household has less room than it thought, less room for error, less room for flexibility, less room for confidence. And that is why a fuel increase can make people feel financially worse so quickly, even before the effects spread more fully through the rest of their costs. So before getting into the mechanics of why gas prices move the way they do, it is worth understanding the basic reality families are dealing with. The pressure begins fast. It is visible immediately. And because driving is tied to work, family, and routine, the burden is felt not as an optional expense, but as part of everyday survival in the modern economy. That is the visible problem. Gas prices rise, and households feel the strain right away. But the larger issue, and the one that matters most, is what comes next. Because for many families, the first increase is only the beginning. The real question is why the pressure lasts so much longer than the initial move that caused it. The central reason this pressure feels so immediate is that gasoline is one of the fastest ways broader stress in the system reaches ordinary people. When fuel markets tighten, or when the cost of supplying gasoline rises, the effect can appear at the retail level very quickly. People do not need to understand the technical side of refining or wholesale pricing to recognize the result. They see it in the posted number before they see it anywhere else. That speed matters. It means households often feel the consequences before they have had time to adjust. A change in fuel prices does not wait for the next month's budget cycle. It does not arrive with advance notice. It appears in the middle of an ordinary week, in the middle of routines that are already fixed. Work still starts at the same time. School still starts at the same time. The grocery run still has to happen. Daily life does not slow down to give households time to adapt. This is why gasoline has such a strong economic effect. The price can move quickly, but the obligations tied to that price remain constant. Families cannot renegotiate the need to drive in the same way they might delay another expense. So when fuel becomes more expensive, the adjustment has to happen somewhere else. That is where the real impact begins. The first response is usually not dramatic, it is practical. People start making small decisions differently. They combine trips, they become more selective about where they drive. They pay closer attention to the gas station they choose. They become more careful with discretionary spending because they know one basic cost has already become less predictable. None of these changes looks major on its own, but together they show something important. The household is no longer spending from confidence. It is spending from caution. That shift from confidence to caution is one of the most important parts of this story. A rise in gas prices does more than reduce disposable income. It changes the way households think. It introduces hesitation into spending decisions that used to feel routine. A family may still be able to pay its bills, but the margin for comfort narrows. Once that happens, the pressure from fuel spreads well beyond transportation. This is the point where one visible cost begins to reshape the rest of daily life. A more expensive commute means less room in the weekly budget. Less room in the weekly budget means more trade-offs. Those trade-offs may be small at first, but they accumulate. A household becomes more careful with errands. It cuts back on optional spending. It starts treating ordinary movement through the week as something that has to be managed more tightly. That tightening of behavior matters because it shows how quickly fuel pressure becomes household pressure. The issue is not only that gasoline costs more, it is that the cost arrives in a place where people have very limited flexibility, and then forces adjustment elsewhere. In practical terms, that means fuel is often one of the first higher costs a family feels and one of the first that changes how the rest of the month is planned. This is also why the effect can spread even when the original price move seems narrow. The fuel purchase itself may happen at the pump, but the response to that purchase reaches into other decisions. A family that feels less secure after filling up may spend more carefully in other categories. It may delay purchases it would otherwise make. It may become more guarded in ways that have nothing to do with the gas station directly, but everything to do with the message the gas station just delivered. Over time, that message becomes clear. A household starts to understand that one of its basic recurring costs has become unstable, and instability changes behavior even more than a one-time increase does. People can often absorb a single higher bill if they believe it is temporary and limited. What is harder to absorb is the sense that a basic cost may keep shifting, and that each shift could require another round of adjustment. That is where the burden becomes heavier than the price itself. The household is no longer only paying more. It is also carrying more uncertainty, and uncertainty has a way of spreading. It affects how people think about other expenses, how much flexibility they believe they have, and how willing they are to spend money even when they technically still can. This helps explain why fuel has such an outsized role in everyday economic life. Gasoline is not the largest bill most families pay, but it can be one of the most disruptive because of how quickly it changes and how visible those changes are. When the price rises, people do not wait for an economist to explain the impact. They feel it immediately in a routine they cannot easily avoid. And once that pressure starts, it rarely stays contained. A household that has become more cautious about fuel often becomes more cautious about everything else as well. That does not mean every family responds the same way, or that every increase produces a crisis. But it does mean fuel can influence the mood and behavior of a household more quickly than many other costs. It has a directness that few other prices have. This is also the reason relief often feels out of sync with the original increase. The price may move up quickly, but the household response lasts longer. Once people have started adjusting, they do not immediately reverse course. Once the budget has tightened, it does not instantly loosen. Once caution has entered the decision-making process, it tends to remain there for a while. That is the deeper economic mechanism behind this story. Gas prices rise fast because they can transmit pressure quickly from the broader system to the pump. But for households, the consequences do not move in the same straight line. The cost increase may be immediate, while the financial recovery is gradual. The result is an experience many families know well. The shock arrives in real time, but the relief never seems to arrive with the same speed. This is why the story cannot be reduced to fuel alone. What begins as a change in one visible price becomes a wider household adjustment. The family spends differently, plans differently, moves differently, thinks differently about what is affordable. And in that way, the rise at the pump becomes a broader economic force inside daily life. By this point, the issue is no longer simply that gas became more expensive. The larger issue is that once the pressure entered the household, it began to spread. And that spread is what makes fuel prices matter far beyond the station itself. This is the part households know well, even if they do not describe it in economic terms. The pressure from higher gas prices shows up immediately, but the sense of relief does not return on the same timeline. That is not only because fuel may remain expensive for a while. It is because once a household has adjusted to stress, that adjustment tends to last longer than the original price movement. A family does not return to normal spending habits the moment the rate of increase slows down. It does not regain confidence simply because the price stops climbing as quickly. Once fuel has taken a larger share of the budget for weeks or months, the household has already changed. Its routines have changed. Its expectations have changed. Its tolerance for risk has changed. That is why relief often feels delayed, even when people are told conditions are stabilizing. Stability in the market is not the same thing as recovery inside the home. A household that has been managing tighter conditions does not immediately start spending with confidence again. It remains cautious. It keeps watching. It continues making smaller decisions through the logic of pressure, not comfort. This is especially true for middle-class households, where financial strain often appears gradually rather than dramatically. These are not always families in immediate crisis. In many cases, they are households that are still working, still paying their bills, still meeting their responsibilities, but doing so with less room than before. They are functioning, but with thinner margins. And when fuel becomes less predictable, those margins become even thinner. That is where the real-life impact becomes more visible. A more expensive tank of gas may not create a financial emergency by itself, but it can contribute to something more persistent. The slow erosion of flexibility. Households begin to feel that more of their income is already spoken for before the month is over. What once felt manageable begins to feel narrow. What once felt routine begins to feel calculated. And over time, that changes behavior in ways that are easy to overlook. Families may not describe it as economic adaptation, but that is exactly what it is. They become more deliberate with travel. They combine errands more often. They put off purchases that are not urgent. They think harder before making small spending decisions that previously did not require much thought. The budget becomes more controlled, but also more constrained. That matters because the effect is cumulative. A single increase in fuel prices can be absorbed. A repeated pattern of instability is harder to absorb. Each new jump reinforces the idea that the household cannot rely on one of its most basic recurring costs to remain predictable. Each period of only partial relief reinforces a second idea. Even when the immediate shock eases, the household may still not get real breathing room back. This is how a pattern forms. Not one bad week, not one unusually expensive fill-up, but a broader rhythm of pressure that keeps returning. The details may vary, but the household experience remains familiar. Costs rise quickly. Adjustment happens immediately. Relief arrives slowly, if it arrives at all in a meaningful way. And after enough repetitions, the household starts to treat that instability as part of normal life. Once that happens, the effect reaches beyond the budget. It influences confidence. Families become less certain about how much room they really have. They become less comfortable making ordinary financial choices. They become more defensive, even when they are still technically getting by. And that shift in mindset is important, because economic pressure is not only about whether bills are paid, it is also about whether daily life feels stable enough to plan with confidence. This is why fuel prices matter more than their share of the budget might suggest. Gasoline may not be the largest monthly expense, but it can be one of the most influential because of how visible, frequent, and unavoidable it is. It is one of the costs that can change how people feel about the rest of their finances. And once that feeling changes, the effect spreads. What this pattern shows is that fuel does not need to dominate the household budget in order to shape household behavior. It only needs to become unstable often enough, and visibly enough, to make people more cautious across the board. That is when a fuel story becomes a broader story about economic pressure in ordinary life. So what should people watch next? Not just the next movement in gas prices, and not only the next headline about energy markets. The more important question is whether households actually regain any breathing room. Do ordinary families begin to feel more flexibility in their weekly budgets? Do they become less cautious about routine spending? Does the pressure from one essential cost begin to ease in a way that changes daily life, not just the number on a sign? That is the real test, because the visible price at the pump is only the beginning. What matters more is whether the larger burden begins to lift, whether families feel less exposed, whether one basic cost stops shaping the rest of the month so aggressively. And that brings the story back to where it started. This was never only about gasoline. It was about the way one essential cost can move through the entire structure of everyday life. It was about how quickly pressure can arrive, how slowly relief can follow, and why that gap matters so much for households trying to maintain stability. Gas prices go up fast. Families feel that immediately. But the deeper reality is that the consequences last longer than the initial move. They remain in the budget, in behavior, and in the quiet calculations households keep making long after the number at the pump first changed. That is why this issue stays with people. Not because fuel is the only pressure they face, but because it is one of the clearest and quickest ways economic stress enters daily life. And once it enters, it rarely stays in one place.